Welcome to this UCL Lunch Hour lecture on cancel culture in queer and trans online worlds. My name is Kyle Beadle, and I'm a PhD candidate in UCL's Department of Computer Science, advised by Dr. Marie Vasek and Dr. Mark Werner. My research investigates intra-community conflict in online communities of non-binary people. We have so far uncovered the ways that non-binary people censor one another's language and expressions of gender identity by reinforcing unspoken community rules. And they often involve repurposing common features of social media platforms to coerce other community members into compliance. My thinking of this work has greatly been informed by my conversations with today's speaker. So it is therefore my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kata Kirola. Dr. Kata Kirola is an associate professor in media studies at the IOE UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, program leader of the Digital Media Critical Studies MA, and a member of UCL's LGBTQ+ Equality Steering Group. Their research focuses on questions of affect, power, and media, how feelings and sensations attach to media images and technologies, as well as to structures and marginalization and hopes for worlds to come. Their publications include The Power of Vulnerability, Mobilizing Affect in Feminist, Queer, and Anti-Racist Media Cultures, The Weight of Images, and in 2014, and articles in journals such as Camera Obscura, Gender and Education, Social Media and Society, Feminist Theory, and Sexualities, just to name a few. So before we begin, uh, there'll be some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido, so sli.io, and entering the event code #online. And now I hand it over to Kata for their talk. Thank you, Kata.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for agreeing to chair this event. And I also want to thank Charlie Lyons and Monique Baker, the event officers from the Vice Provost's office, who invited me to give this UCL lunch hour lecture in honor of the LGBTQ History Month. And I would also like to thank all of you who tuned in today. Thank you especially to my colleagues, friends, and loved ones who I know are watching. So, in today's talk, I examine the various sides of the phenomenon that has come to be called cancel culture, particularly as it's relevant for and sometimes happens within queer and transgender online worlds. By queer and transgender online worlds, I mean loosely defined communities and spaces online where LGBTQ+ people's everyday lives unfold, spaces where multiple genders, sexualities, and bodies are welcome and celebrated. For me, as a queer and non-binary scholar of media, gender, and sexuality, these online worlds are also my worlds. Worlds which I both study and live my life in. But what happens when conflict arises within these worlds? What kinds of forces are at work behind such implosions, which might feel all the more devastating exactly because so many of us turn to these worlds for affirmation and care when the world at large is hostile? Now, as you probably know, cancel culture is a hotly debated topic today. It is defined by media scholar Meredith Clark as an activist practice to withdraw one's support from someone or something whose values, action, inaction, or speech are offensive. But recently, cancellation practices have evolved into something much more complex than captured in this citation, fueled even by the very powers they were originally meant to critique. So I'm interested in asking why these cancellations seem to be happening now, when platforms and governments around the world are censoring and targeting LGBTQ people, literally trying to cancel us. Who or what do such cancel cases end up benefiting? I'll discuss these questions today, particularly through two examples. The cancellation of Carla Sofia Gascon, who you can see in the image on the left of the slide. This cancellation has been unfolding just over the last 2 weeks. Gascon plays the lead role in the movie Emilia Perez, and she is the first openly transgender actor to be nominated for an Oscar. And the other one is Elliot Page, but he was not out as transgender at the time of the nomination. The second example I'll discuss is the cancellation of trans YouTuber ContraPoints, or Natalie Wynn, who you can see in the image on the right. But let's first take a closer look at the case of Carla Sofia Gascon. The Netflix-produced movie Emilia Perez premiered last year at the Cannes Film Festival, and at first its reception was enthusiastic. I don't want to give you too many spoilers if you haven't seen the film yet, but I will say it tells the story of a Mexican drug cartel leader, played by Gascon, who is secretly a trans woman and decides to stage her own death, undergo medical gender reassignment, and start a new life as Emilia Perez, with the help of a lawyer played by Zoe Saldana. This movie is a bit of a wild mix of genres. It combines exaggerated, surreal melodrama in the style of telenovela with gritty, violent crime thriller, and adds into the mix musical. Now, I saw Emilia Perez at a movie theater in November, and I really, really loved it. This has since become a wildly unpopular opinion online. I love this movie exactly because it was so outrageously bonkers, but also because it has something rare in mainstream cinema. It has trans joy and a trans character whose story is about a lot more than her transness. Emilia Perez is a complex character who is both generous and selfish, romantic and toxic, violent and gentle. But through December and January, it became trendy to vehemently hate and ridicule Emilia Perez in queer and trans online communities. Drag queens, influencers, and queer media outlets posted a snarky takedown after another about how much they thought the movie sucked, how bad its trans representation was, and how unrealistic its representation of Mexico and Mexicans was. First, I was a bit amused, since I find it generally interesting when people see the same movie in wildly different ways. But then I started to get annoyed, as the hatred really picked up speed. Really? Why is this suddenly the most hated movie of the year when there are so many pointless and overly long straight movies to choose from to hate? And then Carla Sofia Gascon's tweets from 5 years ago came to light just a couple of weeks ago. Now, these tweets were bad, without a doubt, especially in their blatant Islamophobia. Some of her tweets included misinformation that reflected some of the Islamophobic conspiracy theories that circulated in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the tweets also weirdly seemed to make fun of the same conspiracy theories. Gascon did also say in her tweets that she hates all major world religions and thinks they are oppressive to women. Now, I won't repeat any of the actual content of those tweets now, but you can find out more easily enough if you Google it. Anyhow, after the publication of the tweets, Gascon issued a public apology, saying that she does not think like that anymore and is deeply sorry for the harm she caused. but it was too late. Since then, Gascon has been quite thoroughly cancelled. She deactivated her X account as a result of massive targeting and even death threats to herself and her daughter. Netflix has removed her from the Emilia Perez PR campaign. Her book publisher has dropped her, and the director of the film, Jacques Audiard, and other actors of the film like Zoe Saldana and Serena Gomez have denounced not only the views she expressed in the tweets, but Gascon as a person. The first time that an openly trans actress was nominated for an Academy Award, she has received incredible visibility, but the majority of this visibility is hateful. Now, I'm not saying that people should not be held accountable for their words. They should be. And of course, trans people can be racist, just like any other people. But is it just a coincidence that this happened at the exact same time as Donald Trump and his allies started to forcibly implement the cruel and unseemly erasure of LGBTQ plus people, women's rights, race equality initiatives, and indeed all diversity, equity, and inclusion related policies from the US government? Is it just a coincidence that this cancellation happened at the same time as major US-based big tech companies, Meta, Amazon, and Google, have announced that they are officially removing their DEI policies and protections from hate speech? Now, I'm not sure, but I very strongly suspect that it is not only the queer and trans critics or the people in the communities that Gascon's old tweets targeted who are driving this cancellation campaign. People or political actors who want to fuel public anti-trans sentiments have surely seen this as an opportunity to feed the fury towards a very visible transgender actress and drive her out of the public eye. People in the LGBTQ plus community do not dare to defend Carla Sofia Gascon either now, despite her expressions of remorse, and regardless of whether they love or hate the movie, for the understandable fear of being seen as a racist or an Islamophobe themselves, or for fear of being shunned by the very worlds that we depend on for support and safety, now perhaps more than ever. In the movie, Emilia Perez is redeemed, but in real life, Carla Sofia Gascon's chances for redemption do not seem like a real possibility. Now, my aim in asking how and why cancellations happen within queer and trans online communities is not to say that these communities, indeed my communities, would be somehow extraordinarily quarrelsome and toxic. They are not. But they are, for better or for worse, a part of the world at large. And here I am reminded of Jose Esteban Munoz, a queer of color theorist, and his poetic words on queerness as utopia on the first page of the book Cruising Utopia from 2009. And I quote, "Queerness allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. Queerness is that thing that allows us to feel that this world is not enough. Queerness is essentially about a rejection of a here and now and an insistence on a potentiality or concrete possibility for another world." Now, in relation to the example I just presented, these words might seem naive, but I would argue that cancellations within queer and trans online worlds are symptomatic of at least two related things. On one hand, this longing for a queer utopia, somehow pure and free of all the horrors and nastinesses of the current world. And on the other hand, the way that queer worlds and the quagmire of the present seep into and mirror each other. Now, the internet overall is a space which, ever since its public inception in the 1990s, has occupied a space of utopias and dreams in the queer and transgender imaginations. It has been seen as a place of unlimited play, self-exploration, and freedom from some oppressive gender and sexual norms. Queerness and transness are much more visible in the media and online than perhaps ever. Yet increased visibility does not mean increased power or increased safety, but it can also mean increased risk. Now, study after study on LGBTQ people online show that while the utopian dreams persist, LGBTQ youth and people of all ages are also cyberbullied significantly more than their straight or cisgendered peers, and Western and non-Western platforms regulate LGBTQ content and activities with things like outright censorship, single identity policies, shadow banning, content moderation, trolling, and algorithmic bias. The recent policy changes for Meta are, in a way, only making explicit what we already know from research and experience. Meta platforms were already performing poorly in relation to LGBTQ people's safety. And yet, study after study show also how queer and trans people have always found our way to imaginatively escape regulation, to fly under the radar, to create spaces for play and pleasure, even in highly repressive times, throughout the existence of the internet and much, much longer. More pervasive regulation may require more inventive or aggressively playful strategies, such as those of Alec Vadmenen, who is a gender non-conforming, trans feminine, brown activist and performer. They tend to troll back their trolls with kindness and love, as you can see on the screenshot on this slide. But the question is, how to actually stop these powerful spaces of care and activism from fragmenting, especially when we should be forming coalitions across differences to fight much bigger fights. So let's move on to unpacking the notion of cancel culture in more detail. Here is my quick and dirty summary of the key contexts of cancel culture and how the term cancel culture is circulating right now. First of all, we have the definition presented in the beginning of this talk, where cancellation refers to the grassroots activist practice on and off social media of boycotting influential people, companies, institutions, or governments who say or do something considered destructive, offensive, or abusive to marginalized communities, and importantly, who seem to otherwise escape accountability. This understanding of cancellation is often traced back to the notion of the call-out, which, according to Meredith Clark, originated from Black Twitter in the early 2010s. Andre Brock writes that Black women's call-out practices on early Black Twitter were already then accused of mob mentality and demonization of individuals rather than seen as critiques of systematic inequality. We can trace the gradual fading of the language of the call-out and the mainstream emergence of the language of cancellation to the late 2010s, when collective social media action created very real social transformation, as we saw with, for example, the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. Transformation that might now be in the process of being undermined. But notably, already in these early years, just like today, the phrase, "you're cancelled," was also used jokingly, as it took on a life of its own on the internet. And here you can see a little meme that jokes about cancel culture. According to Eve Eng, in her 2022 book, Cancel Culture, Me Too movement turbocharged cancel culture, which has since evolved into more troubling forms, where a sense of scale disappears and someone who made a single dubious post years ago is treated the same way as, for example, known and convicted sexual offenders like the movie producer Harvey Weinstein. Since then, it has become standard practice of PR agencies to do a deep dive into any celebrity's social media presence, and I find it quite surprising, actually, that this was not done with Carla Sofia Gascon. Now, the second practice of using the notion of cancel culture is its weaponization by the alt-right, by Donald Trump and the likes of him, by anti-trans politicians and writers, or whole governments to dismiss critiques as witch hunts, attacks on freedom of speech, or attacks on their safety. The paradox is that often these complaints about being attacked, silenced, or deplatformed are given very public platforms. This has led to a situation where, at least in my view, one of the key issues driving support for the anti-trans movement and rhetoric in the US and in the UK is, paradoxically, their very visible claims of being under aggressive attack by queer and trans feminist activists. Notably, not that many people even knew some of these anti-trans voices before they were deplatformed, quote unquote. Now, thirdly, we can think of the way that many feminist, queer, trans, anti-racist, and pro-Palestine activists and scholars get massively targeted or very literally banned or cancelled on social media and in real life. But this is not called cancel culture. And fourthly, the topic of today, we can talk about the ways in which practices of cancellation happen also within marginalized communities. Now, claims to voice through claims of victimhood and vulnerability are nothing new, just like the practice of grassroots boycotting is nothing new. If we think about what vulnerability means, this should come as no surprise, since vulnerability has been theorized as paradoxical. It can be both a restraint and a potential. It is both an ontological necessity shared by us all, meaning that we are all vulnerable, all human and non-human life is fragile, porous, and mortal, and vulnerability is distributed unevenly due to sociocultural power structures. So we may all be injurable, but we are not injured in the same ways. In a book that I edited together with Anu Koivunen and Ingrid Rydberg in 2018, called The Power of Vulnerability, we analyzed the emergence of a historically grounded but partly new language of vulnerability, where vulnerability paradoxically becomes a claim to power. This dynamic is not only visible in privileged people's complaints about being cancelled, but it is also visible in debates within activist movements and within queer, feminist, and anti-racist research about who can or who should speak for or about various marginalized groups. In this dynamic, the language of vulnerability may sometimes even look like a competition between disadvantaged groups who is more or more severely marginalized because they should have the first and foremost voice. Activist and author Naomi Klein makes a similar point in her book, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World, where she explores the current political and cultural polarization and the appeal of what she calls the mirror world, the world of conspiracy theories, anti-vaxxers, and the alt-right, where they appropriate the language of social justice movements while claiming that they are injured by these very movements. In the mirror world, the marginalized are the oppressors, and the alt-right wear deplatforming as a badge of honor, as Klein puts it. But while some of the dynamics of the mirror world might be new, the appropriation of the language of vulnerability is not new. Already in 1983, feminist scholar Marilyn Frye stated, and this was in response to claims that everyone suffers, therefore everyone is oppressed. And she said, and I quote, "This is nonsense. Human beings can be miserable without being oppressed. And it is perfectly consistent to deny that a person or group is oppressed without denying that they have feelings or that they suffer." End of quote. In this appropriation of a language of suffering and vulnerability, boundaries are often blurred between those who feel discomfort or threat and those who are systematically oppressed. Here we can think of, for example, the question of gender-segregated toilets and changing rooms. Anti-trans voices claim that the mere presence of trans women makes cis women feel threatened, when there is no research evidence that trans people's presence would actually lessen women's safety. And there is plenty of research evidence showing that trans and gender non-conforming people regularly experience verbal and physical harassment by cisgender people in toilets. However, women are, of course, oppressed, harassed, and sexually assaulted in appalling numbers, and the society is failing women in that regard. Just not by trans people, who are not even that many in the end. But actually, a similar logic applies to some cancellations within queer and trans online worlds, namely that sudden feeling of rage or offense, which is claimed to be a sign of oppression. And the targets of these cancellation calls are not necessarily powerful individuals. In such cases, a sense of scale and context easily disappears, and cancellation can happen for shockingly small things. An example of this is YouTuber ContraPoints, or Natalie Wynn, who's a white trans woman and has been widely praised for her snarky, smart, visually cool critical analysis of things like the alt-right, Jordan Peterson, incels, J.K. Rowling, among many other themes. She's even been credited with actually changing some alt-right supporters' minds with her videos, all through developing an ironic tone that is typical for online discussion forums. And she actually aims to understand the people and ideologies that she critiques. Currently, ContraPoints has 1.85 million followers on YouTube. And she has told publicly that she's able to support herself with her YouTube and Patreon income. Now, in January 2020, ContraPoints posted a long video analysis about her own experience of being cancelled for having the porn star and trans idol Buck Angel as a voiceover visitor on her video essay, Opulence, for 10 seconds. She was attacked by other Twitter users, many of them self-identified as trans and non-binary people, who called her a traitor for having associated herself with Buck Angel, who in turn had voiced views which can be identified as true scum or transmedicalist. Now, true scum in the trans internet language refers to a belief that only those trans people who experience gender dysphoria and want to medically transition are valid trans people. And this leaves out a plethora of trans, non-binary, and genderqueer bodies and identities. Buck Angel is a white trans man in his early 60s. And just a quick glance at his X account or Instagram will tell you that these are indeed the views that he holds. But he's also a transgender legend. And the 10 seconds of his voiceover on the Opulence video are about him reading out a John Waters quote about how really bad taste is actually good taste. The video overall is a critique of discourses around wealth, economic inequality, and taste. And now let's take a look at this video clip that incited the cancellation of ContraPoints. And apologies, the video will start with advertisements, as that's the earning logic of YouTube.
Hey, how are you? I don't know, my philosophy of style is that people should wear what looks good to them. I was joking earlier when I said my look is bad on accident. I think my aesthetic is good. This is what looks good to me, though I'm aware other people might judge it. I like what John Waters said about there being good bad taste and bad taste.
One must remember, there is such a thing as good bad taste and bad taste. To understand bad taste, one must have very good taste.
I've wondered for a long time why I'm so attracted to bad taste. Like, I technically have the education to know better. I know about Glenn Gould, but I prefer Liberace. Why am I so tacky? I think it's because
so ContraPoints goes on to say that she thinks that it's because she's a transsexual. But you can see from this quick video that if you watch this video only, you would never even know who was speaking in the voiceover part. And in this video, you can already get a general idea of the tone of ContraPoint's YouTube channel.
as I'm a trans.
If you're interested in further details of what happened next, I do recommend that you watch the video essay Canceling by ContraPoints on her YouTube channel. Natalie Wynn describes the devastating effect of the experience of cancellation herself like this, and I quote, "Look, I really don't like to represent myself as a victim, but in a way, leftist Twitter finally accomplished what 4chan, Nazis, stalkers, and TERFs have been trying and failing to do to me for years." End of quote. So I have started to think of cancellation through the idea of contagion, and particularly the contagion of feeling. Several theorists of feelings and emotions listed there on the slide have explored how feelings are contagious and how this contagion has very real consequences. For example, large-scale societal and political shifts are most often based on emotion, not on who has better arguments. But emotional states are not floating and catching like viruses either. They do not just happen accidentally. Shifts in emotional atmospheres and the way that rage spreads must be understood through their social, cultural, and technological contexts. What enables specific patterns of contagion at a certain point in time? So how are cancellations contagious? First of all, like Natalie Wynn points out, the anger and the cancellation tends to spread almost uncontrollably from the cancelled person to those associated with the cancelled person. This happened in her case, and this can be seen in the way that Carla Sofia Gascon's co-stars are taking distance from her in public. Secondly, like in Wynn's comparison of 4chan to leftist Twitter, the type of language used in online cancel practices is quite similar in terms of strong derogatory and shaming expressions. From the language, you can't really even tell if these are trolls or activists. Thirdly, there is the already mentioned context where trans people and the LGBTQ community at large are being bullied, trolled, harassed, and erased by politicians, anti-trans campaigners, governments, and platforms. Being a target of harassment is enraging. But where can that rage go? It's most understandable it has to go somewhere. When the world at large is just not listening, not caring about your rage, the only ones who will listen, who the rage will have an impact on, are the people within our communities. But sadly, when the rage goes against our own, we are not necessarily making our communities better, safer, or more caring. But we are encouraging peer surveillance and policing in a twisted mirror image of the platforms already surveilling us. Now, there are and there will be really important disagreements which must be tackled. But without attention to context and scale, those can damage the actually important political struggles. So while the purpose of those who pointed out that Buck Angel is true scum was to protect trans and non-binary people from feeling invalidated, this claim to right of judgment based on vulnerability seems to have become entangled with rage, blowing out of proportion, pitting non-binary people against trans women in a way that is utterly nonsensical, and in the process, the larger context disappeared from view. That cancellations like this within queer and trans worlds play directly into the hands of powerful anti-LGBTQ forces. We should not be giving them what they want. Another key thing is also that in order to understand cancellation events as part of the quagmire of the present following Munoz, we need to understand the platform economies that thrive and depend on conflict and cancellation, because they depend on concentration of attention. As Shoshana Zuboff argues in her 2018 book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, alongside many other digital scholars, today's platforms and big tech companies function through monetizing our attention. Emotional reactions and intensity produce more traffic and therefore more money. Platform algorithms lift up content that is receiving attention, since that for the platform economy, it doesn't matter if this attention is negative or positive. Only the quantity matters. Paradoxically, this also means that in the long run, the key actors in cancellations might profit from it financially. Rebecca Lewis and Angela Christin, in an article on so-called platform drama, found that many YouTubers who were at some point cancelled gained followers over a longer period of time. And also the channels that commented on the cancellations profited from it. Similarly, although ContraPoints took a hit in the short term, her following has not suffered in the long term, but remained pretty steady and actually slowly growing. Lewis and Kristin's study was based on interviews with content producers of so-called drama channels on YouTube, which are channels dedicated to reporting on YouTube celebrities, particularly scandals and conflicts. So while in the short term, influencers involved in cancellation might lose followers and YouTube might demonetize their videos for a period of time, as in take away ad revenue from specific videos, in the long term, those videos and commentary videos still receive a lot of views and traffic. And both the platform, the YouTubers involved, profit from the cancellation process. And this has led to a situation where many influencers actually fabricate conflicts and cancellations intentionally. This has become a part of the wider culture of platform drama. In fact, this raises the question whether expressions of rage in online cancellations are even rage. Whitney Phillips has argued in her book, This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, where she interviewed self-identified online trolls, that online aggressive behavior is not necessarily driven by genuine hate, but by much more vague, but no less intense, longings for jolts, for kicks, for feeling something, feeling other people react to you. So here, a strive for something much messier than rage meets the earning logic of the platforms. Another open question is if the flames of online rage in cancel events and otherwise are driven by people, or how much of the traffic is manufactured, driven by trolls or bots. What we know is that, for example, the Russian government and certain alt-right organizations do very purposefully manufacture and use trolls to inflame online conflict, especially nationalist, anti-feminist, anti-gender, anti-queer, and anti-trans sentiments. Now, in cancel events, such as in the cancellation of Carla Sofia Gascon and ContraPoints, the cancelled people often try to change the course of contagion by issuing a public apology. But, like ContraPoints explains in her video Cancelling, and like Louis and Christine found in their study on cancelled YouTubers, and like we can see in Gascon's cancellation, public apologies do not usually work to soothe the situation. They are expected, they are demanded, but they tend to only fuel the cancellation further, as they are regularly seen as disingenuous and insincere. However, they do generate more attention and more traffic. Now, as I'm approaching the end of this talk, I'd like to return to the question, how do we then allow space for intra-community critique, but don't let it become destructive? How can we hold on to the utopian dreams of queer and trans online worlds as spaces for pleasure, freedom, and experimentation? How do we avoid creating our little mirror worlds that reflect back into our communities the very rage that we're trying to resist? Now, my preliminary argument is perhaps a relatively boring one, that we need to understand cancellations and contagions of rage through the complicated contexts in which each of them happens, including the dynamics of social media platforms, and not just discuss cancel culture as if it was all one thing. I hope I've also shown that when thinking about how to create queer and trans worlds as communities of care and protest, calling for cancellations or deplatforming will often be counterproductive. This does not mean that we should tolerate hate speech or harassment or just turn the other cheek when we're being hit. But in the contemporary platform economy, we need to consider a few steps ahead where we want to draw attention and with what consequences. A better strategy might be creating attention where we do want it for things that might offer hope, joy, and support. Another way to resist the pull of fragmentation is to welcome every well-meaning ally. In the current situation, we need all the support we can get, and coalitions cannot be based on identity categories, but on the things we stand for. And sometimes we may need to make compromises and forgive when people say they are sorry, even when they don't do it in the perfect way. At the moment, there are enough people spewing hatred upon us who are not sorry at all. And let me end this talk with a quote by Alok Vadmenon, whose strategy of killing trolls with kindness I mentioned earlier in this talk. Just a couple of weeks ago, Alok was discussing humor as resistance, and I quote, "If you spend a couple of centuries surviving attempted eradication, you get kind of bored of being depressed. It's just a major buzzkill. And what's profoundly rebellious when you're a marginalized person is recognizing that people might have the ability to take away your rights. They might have the ability to take away your safety, but they can't take away your joy." End of quote. And at the risk of sounding naive, we must insist that other kinds of worlds are possible, worlds that function on the principle of irrepressible joy. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Kata. That was a great closing quote. And now we're going to take some questions from the audience. Our audience can find a link in the description to the YouTube stream that leads to the Slido where they can ask questions. While people do that, I will start with a question of my own. I found the choice of case studies to be quite fascinating because both cancellations center trans feminine people and trans women. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the gendered aspects involved in cancel culture among queer and trans people.
Yeah, that's actually something that I've only started considering, and I do find it quite fascinating. Um, Also in relation to how, um, women in general, like for example, how women politicians are always under uh, much more surveillance in the public eye than male politicians. And that might be the case also for trans women and trans feminine people, that somehow the larger culture of misogyny just makes them sort of like elevates them um, as targets of very keen surveillance and kind of targets of people looking for mistakes that they might make in order to justify um, a fall from fame or such. But I have to say that these kinds of cancel events do not only target trans women in queer and trans online worlds. For example, in the 2019, 2020, in the YouTube beauty influencer community, there was a whole big mess where beauty influencers who are gay men, like James Charles, were canceled. And well, that's a whole another kind of a can of worms that that cluster of cancel events, but then definitely gay men were being the ones who were really targeted by cancellation campaigns. So I think that there is a paradoxical kind of gender equality going on there. But right now, when trans women and trans people are being under attack, it does seem kind of convenient that Carla Sofia Gascon is getting so much hatred online.
So we have lots of great questions in the Slido here. To get us started, how much influence do you feel platforms have on cancel culture behaviors within queer and trans communities?
Yeah, I think that they have more influence than we'd want to think. I think that both the platforms and many bad faith actors that are functioning on these platforms follow very closely what is happening in queer and transgender online worlds. And algorithms might accentuate things whenever attention is starting to focus on one topic. And so this kind of functions as a technological and human combination where then algorithms might accentuate certain kind of content, then humans kind of get interested in that content, and that just gets the ball spinning. But I think that also there is manufactured attention. A lot of it is happening with very firm political purposes. We know that there are troll factories, bot factories, which will jump on any kind of piling if it happens to be in alignment with their larger political goals. So I think that, yeah, platform economies, platform logics absolutely do play a key role in cancel events.
And we have another one here. Why do you feel that it is so much of the contention centers around trans people at the moment?
Yeah, I think that I know that there are many theories around this. Alok Vadmenen, who I just cited at the end of my talk, uh, has said that, oh, it might be about vulnerability, or this is my interpretation of what Alok says, that since we are all vulnerable, we might be able to create kind of like a falsified sense of safety when we say that only certain people are a threat, or only certain people are the ones that we should refuse or eject from the public eye, and then we'll be safe. But of course, this is a fallacy because nobody is safe. And I think that here in the current moment, we are seeing how anti-trans sentiment has somehow been fueled by both mainstream media and platform economies. And it has become kind of like the Trojan horse to also start implementing policies that actually target a much wider group of people, several different marginalized communities. And I would say that people should keep in mind that the anti-trans sentiments will eventually be combined and are being combined with misogyny, hatred of women, hatred of refugees, immigrants. Like, there are so many studies showing that political movements that ride on anti-trans sentiments are also pushing these really serious policies of inequality. So even people who are not unequivocally for trans rights should think about what they end up supporting when they are anti-trans. And I would really invite such reconsiderations.
Hmm. So we're going to take two more questions. The first of which being, do you think cancel culture means different things to different people depending on their background, generation, for example?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think maybe something that I didn't really discuss in the talk enough is that the words cancel culture have been quite strongly adopted by the alt-right. So this weaponization of cancel culture has almost like become what cancel culture means. And this appropriation of meaning is something that, for example, Naomi Klein discusses at length in the book Doppelganger, that any social justice movement, any social justice idea can be appropriated by exactly the forces that we oppose and twisted into something that might then start working against us. And I think that this is exactly what is happening with cancel culture. So So yeah, there's been a kind of like a hijacking of meaning, because cancellation can, like I mentioned, be also a really powerful activist strategy. And that's how it started. Um, calling out these sexual predators that had been able to like do their thing for decades until social media forced attention on them, and then legal justice slowly followed. Um, or, in Black Lives Matter movement, it was thanks to the social media campaigning that it was possible to hold powers that be accountable in a whole another way than had been possible up until then. So I'm not saying that this cannot be the powerful activist strategy. So yes, I do think that cancel culture does mean different things to different people, depending on whether you're involved in kind of activist campaigning, whether you're just kind of watching the world unfold, what your age is. Perhaps if you are someone who consumes YouTube and TikTok a lot, you have seen these kinds of dramas happen so often that you're already kind of bored. It does very much depend on who you are, what your aims are, what kind of content you consume online. Yes.
Right. So we have 3 more minutes, and maybe this is a very large question to end on. How can we, as a queer community, stop reproducing cancel culture among ourselves?
Mhm. It is a very good question, because, like I said, we also need to have ways of holding people accountable for what they do and say. But I think that what we need to consider these days is that how publicly do we want to do that? And what the larger context, what the larger moment that we're living in is, and who we might end up benefiting kind of accidentally when we're just trying to do the right thing. I think that this may sound super naive, but I think that radical kindness has a place within queer communities. And indeed, I know that anyone who has been queer online knows that there is a lot of very radical kindness and welcoming and ease within these worlds. So it's a real pity that these kinds of purity events, these kinds of like shunning of certain voices from within the community do happen. I think that we need to be careful of not jumping on the bandwagon when this is happening. We should be brave in saying that, look, like I really think that Carla Sofia Gascon's tweets were horrible, but she did apologize. So let's put some emphasis also on the beauty of having first trans actor in the Academy Awards. Let's be fearless, let's be brave, let's defend one another, while also trying to, navigate the difficult conversations that are bound to happen. I know that that's maybe too general and vague, but that's the best answer I have so far.
Well, thank you, Kata, for your lecture today, and thank you all to those who asked questions. We would like to let you know that the next lunch hour lecture is on the 18th of February, next week, on avatar therapy, what happens when people with acute psychosis meet the voices in their heads. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, and thank you for those great questions. They were really good. Thanks for joining.